Okay, Servlet Basics. So we are going to cover Servlet in 3 sessions. The first 2 sessions is about basics. So I'm going to call up first session Basics 1 and the second session is a Basics 2, and then we are going to cover advanced topics of Servlet as well. So here we are going to cover what is Servlet and where Servlet fits in Java EE application. And then we are going to look into request and response model and the life cycle, and then request, HTTP servlet request class, and then we are going to see URL. We are going to dissect how URL is going to get mapped into servlet. And next week we are going to cover the rest of the Servlet Basics topic, servlet response. We'll talk about the concept of scope object and error handling. And third week of Servlet sessions, we are going to talk about advanced topics of Servlet. For example, session tracking, Servlet filters, Servlet lifecycle events, including forwarding and redirecting to other Servlet or JSP, and some concurrency issues and concept of invoker Servlet. Moving forward, what is Servlet? Servlet, you can think of a Java object that extends the HTTP server functionality for creating dynamic contents. So we are going to talk about the concept of static contents and dynamic contents in the following slide. So Servlet and JSP together are used for creating dynamic contents. And it is mapped to URL. Actually, URL that is coming from the client will be mapped to a servlet. So the servlet URL is mapped to servlet, and servlets are basically Java objects, and they are managed by servlet container. And the servlet is a framework as well, a low-level framework, and it is being supported on all web servers and app servers. So it is a standard. So it is, because it's standard, it is platform and server independent, meaning you can use any server out there and they should support servlet. Okay, difference between static versus dynamic contents. So static contents are typically static HTML page, and basically it is a static contents, meaning everyone see the same content. On the other hand, dynamic contents that are generated by Servlet or JSP is the contents that is dynamically generated during runtime based on some conditions. The conditions could be user identity. For example, depending on which user is accessing that servlet, it might generate a different dynamic contents. It might be time of the day. Depending on the day, depending on time of the day, different contents could be generated. And also user entered values through forms and selections could be also the impact what gets generated at the back end. For example, if the user is actually entering some product number in a form field, that product number will actually extract some information about that product number 1, and that is dynamically generated during runtime. So examples of these dynamic contents are we actually see everywhere, like a E-Trade web page customized just for you, and your Yahoo web page is also actually customized just for you. Of course, Google web page and all those, the typical websites are customized depending on who it is actually talking to. Okay, so this is the first simple servlet code. So your servlet, in this case hello servlet, extends HTTP servlet class, and you are going to override toGet method implementation. toGet method will receive HTTP servlet request object and HTTP servlet response object. And here you are going to set the content type. So in this case, you're not doing any business logic. You are just returning a simplest possible response message. So you are setting the content type of the response message, and then you get the print outrider upstream object, and then you're basically sending this particular XML fragment as a HTTP response message. So we are going to dissect this code in a bit more detail moving forward. Now, before Servlet was born, the web servers were using CGI, and CGI was in fact the precursor before Servlet is born. So CGI was typically written in C, C++, Visual Basics, or Perl, and it has several disadvantages. Nobody's using CGI anymore, well, actually except a few cases. It's difficult to maintain, it's not scalable, and it's not manageable. It's actually prone to security problems of a programming language of choice, and it's resource intensive and inefficient, and we'll see why that is the case in the following slide. And it's platform and application specific. On the other hand, Servlet is written in Java. Because it's written in Java, it should be able to run on any platform that supports JVM, regardless of operating system, regardless of hardware, regardless of the server implementation. It's powerful and reliable and efficient, and it provides scalability and reusability. So we are going to see why that is the case as opposed to the CGI limitations in the following slide. And leverages built-in security of Java programming language. Java is built with the security in mind, so it's taking advantage of Java security. And it's platform independent and portable. So once you have a servlet code, it should be able to run on any server, whether that server is a Tomcat or a Glassfish or WebSphere, it doesn't matter. Okay, moving forward. So this is a comparison between Servlet and CGI. So when CGI-based web server is actually handling the request coming from the client, for every single request, a new process has to be created. Okay, so in this case, it has created 3 different processes handling each of those requests. On the other hand, Servlet-based web server, so you could have a Servlet 1 instance and Servlet 2 instance, and instead of creating new process, it's going to create a new thread. So for this case, it will have a different thread handling the client request. So this is a bit of repeat of what we just talked about in previous slide. So advantages of Servlet over CGI. So there is no CGI. Well, of course, CGI limitations are not in the Servlet architecture. And there are abundant tools and web servers supporting Servlet because it's a Java standard. And because it's a Java, you can access all Java libraries out there, and including Java libraries that come with the JDK, as well as Java libraries that are built by third-party vendors or open source. And it's reliable and better performance and scale. And it's again platform and server independent. It's secure, and most servers allow automatic reloading of Servlet by administrative action. So it's efficiently handling even deployment. Okay, moving forward. Servlet in a big picture of Java EE application. So on the client side, you have a browser. So browser is sending HTTP request, and Servlet along with JSPs are the first tier that actually receive those requests. And as part of business logic processing, it might talk to EJB, and it might actually talk to database directly. And then once business logic is done, then it will create the response message and send it to the client, in this case browser. Okay, so let's talk about the Servlet request and response model. So this is something that we are very familiar with. If you're using the web, this is how things work. So browser sending HTTP request, that request will be handled by a servlet. Okay, so that request will be handled by a servlet, and all these servlets are running inside a servlet container. Servlet container might have multiple servlets, and once servlet is done with the business processing, it will create a response message, and that response message is sent back to the browser. So what does Servlet do? So as I said before in the previous slide, it receives client request, and the client request is in the form of HTTP request, and then it will extract some information from the request, like query parameters and things like that, and then it will perform some business logic processing, and again, business logic processing might delegate it to EJB or web services, or it might directly access databases itself. Okay, so whatever business logic processing is performed, and then it will then create a response that contains the result of the processing, and then the response will be sent back to the client. Or Servlet might forward the request to another servlet or JSP. So this is called a forwarding, and we will talk about this concept of forwarding in the advanced servlet session. So a little bit of repeat of what we talked about. What is a request? So request contains information that is sent from the client to the server. So information that it might contain include who made the request. Okay, so if the request is coming from the client, in the client who actually making a request is in the request message, and what user entered data is sent. So user might actually send some data in the request, and also HTTP, and because it's HTTP, the headers should be also sent to the server. Response, on the other hand, is information sent to the client from the server, and it could be text, it could be HTML, it could be plain, or it could contain binary data as well, and it also, of course, contains headers, and it could contain cookies. So HTTP request contains structure-wise the headers and the method and request data. So method could be get, post, put, delete, and things like that, but get and post, those are the most important HTTP method. So let's talk about those two in a bit more detail. So HTTP get and HTTP post are the most common HTTP methods. And HTTP get request, in this case, user entered information is appended to the URL in a query string. So you might actually have seen this URL. So this is the destination, meaning the servlet, and it could be servlet or it could be JSP, and then question mark, and then first name equals Sang and ampersand, and last name equal Shin. So in this case, we are sending to the query parameters. Okay, so this is a key value pair. So we have a two key value pair. The first one's key name is first name, and the second one's key name is last name, and this is the value of the first key, and this is the value of the second key or second query parameter. On the other hand, if you're using post to send some data, in this case, the data, user entered data, will be sent inside the HTTP message. Okay, so instead of a URL, it will be inside HTTP message. Okay, so this is the servlet, simplistic servlet code again. So again, it basically, in this case, you are receiving HTTP servlet request object and HTTP servlet response object, and then you're basically creating a response message, and one of the things you can do is set content type, and then in this case we're actually sending these two lines to the client. Okay, moving forward, and let's look into servlet classes and interfaces. So on the top you have a servlet, and then generic servlet is so by the way, these yellow boxes are interfaces and the green boxes are classes. So servlet interface is implemented by generic servlet, and one of the subclass of generic servlet is HTTP servlet. And we also have a class called the HTTP session that maintains session state. And then we have servlet request interface, which has child interface called the HTTP servlet request, and servlet response has HTTP servlet response. And you are mostly dealing with HTTP servlet and HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. The reason that they actually have this hierarchical structure is that there could be possibility that the servlet might handle non-HTTP request, even though that is usually not the case. I mean, 99.9% of the time, the request is on the top of HTTP. Okay, so mostly you are going to deal with HTTP servlet and HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response classes or interfaces. Okay, moving forward, servlet lifecycle. So when the client sends the HTTP request, and the servlet container will check whether a particular servlet that is requested. So again, the URL, the user will send the URL in the form of a request, and based on URL, the servlet container will select a servlet, and it will see whether the servlet has been loaded or not. If it is not, then it will load it. Okay, and then it will once it loaded, then the container will call the servlet, and the servlet will perform the business logic, and then it will generate a response message. Okay, so servlet lifecycle method. So this picture is showing the lifecycle method of servlet. So there is an init method, gets called only once when the servlet gets initialized, and then destroy method of servlet gets called only once servlet is destroyed. And then there is a service method, and then we have a doGet method and doPost method. You're going to mostly deal with doGet method and doPost method, and we'll see the relationship between service and doGet and doPost in the following slide. Okay, so servlet is called by the container. So it is the container actually that receives the request, and then it will determine which servlet is supposed to handle that request, and then it will call servlet, the lifecycle method, meaning container will call the lifecycle method of the servlet. Okay. So two classes. One is called a generic servlet class, and then we have HTTP servlet class. As we talked about, HTTP servlet is a child class of generic servlet class. So generic servlet class has init method and destroy method implementation. Then it also has a service method, which is an abstract method. Okay, so generic servlet is an abstract class because the service method is an abstract method. Because this is an abstract method, the subclass of this generic servlet class, in this case HTTP servlet class, should provide implementation of this service method. So this HTTP servlet class has service method implementation, and it also you also have a doGet, doPost, and doXX method. Typically, you're going to deal with these two. So let's see the relationship between the service implementation, and doGet and doPost inside HTTP servlet class. Okay, before we talk about that, let's talk about init and destroy one more time. So init is called only once when the servlet is first instantiated. So typically you are going to perform some, let's say, initialization or setup, the task in init method. For example, setting up a database connection. Destroy method is called only once when before servlet instance is removed, before servlet instance is destroyed. So you might perform some cleanup operations inside servlet destroy method. For example, closing previously created database connection and things like that. Okay, so this is an example. Suppose you are creating catalog servlet, okay, which extends HTTP servlet, and inside the init method, suppose if you want to have a connection, in this case, bookdb, you are going to, in this case, you want to actually find out the value of what is called the bookdb attribute. So we haven't talked about this getServletContext method. So when you call the getServletContext method, it will return servletContext object. ServletContext object is a context object, contains information about your context, meaning the information, runtime information of your container. And you can save some attribute into servlet context. So in this case, you save this bookdb information as an attribute in the servlet context object. So you can actually get that value of this attribute inside init method, because you need this one in all your servlet operations. So this is actually another example, when you have to read value of an attribute of the servlet context object, you could perform it inside init method, because you want to perform this one just once. Okay, so another example is reading configuration information. So when this init method, you are going to read primary information like the driver information and init the URI information, and then you are going to make a database connection. Okay, now this information could be set inside your web.xml file like this. So for this particular servlet, so remember in our previous presentation, web application architecture and structure, we talk about the web.xml file in detail. So one of the important information that you specify in web.xml file is servlet and its mapping. So this is a servlet. When you specify servlet, you can also include init parameters. Okay, so in this case, the parameter name is driver, and this is parameter value. Another parameter, init parameter is URL, and this is the value. So when you specify these init parameters, these are available to your servlet. Okay, so that's what we see here. Inside init method, we can call getInitParameter method and then provide the key value driver. Then it will return the value that we specify inside the init, the param element. And here, URL is the URL value. Okay, so these values will be retrieved inside init method for creating a database connection. Okay, so again, init method is called once, so you do whatever one-time setup operations inside the init method. Okay, moving forward, destroy method is to clean things up before the servlet gets removed or destroyed. You want to perform the cleanup operations. In this case, we nullify the database attribute. I mean, basically we are just nullifying the variable. Okay, lifecycle method. As I said before, the service method in generic servlet class is an abstract method. So subclass or child class of generic servlet, in this case is HTTP servlet class, has provided implementation of the service method. Now, inside this implementation, depending on HTTP method, it will call doGet and doPost. Okay. Now, when you do write servlet-based application, you do not overwrite service method. Instead, you are going to overwrite doGet, doPost, doXX method in HTTP servlet. Okay, because the service method will perform the dispatch to this method, right? So if you want to perform some business logic, you are going to overwrite this doGet and doPost method. Okay, so in your servlet-based code, you are going to override these two methods rather than service method. Okay. Okay, so a little bit of repeat. Service method take generic request and responses. So again, inside the service method implementation of HTTP servlet, it will call doGet and doPost. And doGet method will receive HTTP servlet request object, that represent HTTP request, and then it also receive HTTP servlet response object. Same thing with do post. Okay. Okay, so this is a little bit of a repeat what we talked about. So when the request comes in, generic servlets, the subclass of generic servlet class, in this case HTTP servlet, implementation of service method will handle it. So inside HTTP servlets, inside HTTP servlet service implementation class, it will call do get and do post method depending on whether HTTP method is a HTTP get or HTTP post. So this is what I'm talking about. So in the case of HTTP servlet subclass, depending on HTTP method that is coming from the client, it will invoke do get and do post. So these two methods are the ones that you want to override in your servlet class. So typical things that you do in do get and do post is you can extract some client-sent information, say for example query parameters and form values and things like that. You might save and get attributes to and from scope objects. We'll talk about the concept of scope object later on, actually next week. So basically scope object is the place where you can actually maintain some key value pairs. Then you can perform some business logic where you can access the database. And optionally, you can forward the request to other web components after you are done with the business processing or before you do the business processing. And then you are going to create the response message and populate it and send it back to the client. So again, this is a simple HTTP, simple servlet code that we have seen before. Okay. Now, this is a bit more sophisticated do get method implementation. So here, you are going to get the session object. Okay, so we haven't talked about the concept of session object yet. Okay, so we'll talk about it later on. Here you're retrieving the value of attribute called messages. So this is a key of the attribute, and what you get back is the value of this key attribute. And then your settings, headers and buffer size before accessing the writer. So you're basically setting the response message, content type and buffer size and things like that. And then you're writing to the response, the output stream. And then you're also performing some including. So we haven't talked about the concept of including yet. So you can include another servlet. Okay, so if you don't understand these 4 lines of code, that's fine. This is a continuation. So here you are getting the value of an attribute called the book ID from the request scope object. Again, we haven't talked about the concept of request scope object yet, but basically scope object is the container that the scope object is the place that you can maintain some key value pairs. Okay, and then we perform some business logic. So we are getting the book details, and then we are getting the price and all that stuff, and then we are sending the response message. Okay, all right. So moving forward. So steps for populating HTTP response. So you fill response headers, and you can set some properties of the response, for example, buffer size, and then you get output stream object from the response, and then you write body content to the output stream. So that's what we have seen. So this is a simple response for creating simple response. So this is in fact the same code that we have seen before. So we are filling response headers with the content type in this case and buffer size, and then we get the output stream object from the response, and then you write the body content to the output stream. Okay. Servlet request. So we are looking into HTTP servlet request class. So your servlet request, the request that is coming from the client, is captured in the form of HTTP servlet request. So the servlet request contains many information, for example, client send parameters, and the locales and client server information, input stream protocol information, and things like that. So we'll actually play around with these things later on. Okay, request comes in. So this is actually showing the forwarding. So instead of the servlet handles the request and send the response right away, it might forward to another servlet. This servlet, after its processing, it might actually send the request to servlet 3. Okay, so this is basically chaining of the servlet. In the context of the servlet architecture, is called forwarding. So forwarding the request to another servlet. Okay, so getting client sent parameters. So when the client sends some information, either as part of the URL when HTTP method is a get, or in the form of as part of the HTTP message in the case of HTTP post, the way that you are going to get the value of those parameters is by calling get parameter method, and then you provide a parameter name. Okay, so as we talked about again, as when the client is sending the parameters in the form of HTTP get, it will be sent as part of the URL. When HTTP method is a post, then the data is going to be as part of the message. Either way, you are going to call get parameter method of your servlet, the HTTP servlet request servlet object, and then you provide a param name and you get the value of it. Okay. And if there is no parameter with this name, then it will return null. And again, you can use this method regardless whether the client is using HTTP get or HTTP post. So suppose the user sent a form data. So it's basically it has the param1, param2, and param3, and then it sent this data by through this form. Okay, so in this case, the value. So what user will actually enter is like this. When this page gets displayed, okay, so this is HTML page, right? When this HTML page is displayed, this is what user see, and user will enter values like a first name, last name, and nickname, right? And when user click this button, it will be submitted. In this case, suppose if the client is sending this data using get, then it's going to be sent as part of the URL. And in that case, well, regardless, I mean, you are going to actually use get parameter method and provide the name of the parameter, param1 in this case. And again, you are using get parameter method to retrieve the value of these parameters. So whatever user typed in here will be captured as will be returned from this method. Okay. When the user is sending the data in the form of HTTP post, in this case, the method has to be set with method equal post. Okay, so exactly the same thing, but it's using HTTP post. So in this case, these data will be sent as part of the HTML message body. However, so this is the code. This is the page user will see. Okay, but as regardless whether the method is a post or get, you are going to still use get parameter method. Okay. So typically what you're going to see in a servlet implementation is because the operation of doGet and doPost are doing the same thing. So you implement one method and then you're basically calling it. So suppose I have some business logic that handles the request, and for doPost it's just calling doGet, passing the same parameters, request and response. Okay. Okay, so whoSet object and value attribute. So request attribute can be sent in two ways. So the servlet container might actually set the attributes. So for example, it might actually set the X509 certificate attribute when HTTPS is actually being used, or you might actually set the servlet attribute by calling set attribute method. So request object is one of the scope object. By being scope object, it could maintain set of attribute. What is an attribute? Attribute is basically key value pairs. Okay, so that key value pair could be set by the servlet container in the case of system attribute, or you can set an attribute of your custom application, meaning your own application custom attribute. Okay, so in this case, you can get the locale information by getting get locale. Okay, so the locale is coming from the client as part of the header, right? The HTTP header, right? So in order to find the locale information, you can call get locale method of your request object, this HTTP servlet request object. In order to find the IP address of the client, you can call get remote address and get remote host, and this is actually providing host name. And the server information, and you can get some miscellaneous information, for example protocol information, content type, whether it is secure or not. So you can call is secure, meaning when it returns true, then it is running on the top of HTTPS. You can get all the cookies by calling get cookies method. So these are the methods of HTTP servlet request object. Okay, HTTP request URL. So when the client is sending URL to your servlet or your servlet container, it is in the form of this HTTP and the host and port, and then request path and query string. Okay, so example is like this. Suppose if you're receiving, if the URL is like a localhost 8080/hello1 and greeting, so the first one is a context. So what is a context? Context basically an ID of that application running on that particular servlet container. So servlet container will actually run multiple applications, right? So each application should have its own context as an identification of that particular application in the container. So, your URL, the URL that is coming from the client should provide unique, let's say, combination of context and servlet of that context, meaning servlet of that application. So that application could have a multiple, let's say, the servlets, right? So you have to specify which servlet that you are actually trying to talk to. Okay, so this is the case. So request path in this case is made of context and servlet name and path information, the rest of it. Okay, so in this case, this hello one is the context, and greeting is going to indicate which servlet it is trying to talk to. In the case of JSP, same thing. So JSP. So this is a context. Now it's trying to talk to JSP, and here lon and /xyz JSP again is actually indicating which JSP is trying to talk to. Okay, so as we are going to talk about in JSP presentation, the web component is in the form of JSP or servlet. Okay, so whatever that comes after the context should uniquely identify which servlet or which JSP web component is trying to talk to. Okay, so the query string is something the user is going to send, right? So in the case of the query strings could be generated as part of the link in your HTML or JSP page. So in this case, bookstore/catalogs, this point to a web component, right? So it could be either servlet or JSP, and then this value add equals 101. So this is the query parameter. Okay, and or you can actually have those things as part of the URL. Okay, so regardless, you can call get parameter method of the request object and then provide the key value, and then you can get the value. So in this case, when this username will be set with the value of Monica. Oops. Okay, so these are other methods that to find out the context path, query string, path information, path translated. So these four methods are used to extract different part of the information of your URL. Request headers. So request headers are basically HTTP headers. So this is an example: accept header, accept encoding, connection, cookie, host, referrer, user agent. These are all HTTP header information. Again, you can find out all this HTTP header information through the methods of HTTP servlet request object. Typically, you don't have to actually learn these things I mean, you don't really deal with you don't really have to know the header information, because these are too low-level information. Usually you don't use those things. So except indicates the MIME types the client, in this case the browser, can handle. Except encoding indicates the encoding the browser can handle. And again, a few other headers. So these are the methods that are available. Again, it is a method. These are the methods available in HTTP Servlet request objects. So you can get the header, you can get headers. So when you actually call in get header, you have to specify the name of the header. When you call get headers, you're getting all the headers in the form of enumeration. You can get all the header names, so all the keys, and then you can get so in this case value of the specified request header as an int. Okay, and you provide the name of the header. Okay, so suppose if you want to show all the request headers, and again you can actually call get method. It's going to tell whether this is HTTP get or HTTP post, request URI and protocol and all these things. So you can find out this information by calling this method. So these are request header information. Alright, so that's the end of the presentation, and let's do the hands-on lab and demo. So in this hands-on lab, we are going to run two applications. One is a Hello World application, Hello 2 application. The other one is the Hello Sample application. So let's run this guy, Hello 2. So this is going to display a very simple URI. So hello, my name is Duke, and what's yours? I'm going to call, I just enter my name and submit, and then it returns this. So you can see, in this case, it's actually sending the data, username equals Sang Shin, right? Okay, so, all right. So if you take a look at this code, it's very simple. It is made of two servlets. Greeting servlet. So greeting servlet will, it basically just returns. So it set the content type, set the buffer size, and then it get the upstream object, and then it's just displaying these things, and then this is the request username. So in this case, because this is actually using the first is actually using get, the username, as you have seen, it was extending like this, right? So basically, by calling get parameter method, specifying this username, what it return is a Sang Shin, right? So this username will be Sang Shin, and then it will just check whether that is not null and it's not length is greater than 0, and then in this case it's going to create the response message. It's actually the forwarding to response. We haven't talked about this request dispatcher things yet, but basically for now you can think of it will send the response. It will actually call the response via servlet. Okay, so going back to response servlet is get the value and it will just return. Okay, the another application is the servlet examples. So this is an example that comes with, oops, here we go. So it comes with a bunch of sample applications, kind of built into, functionality built into a single application. So this is basically calling, you are going to execute it, and it's what gets returned, and you can see the source code. Okay, so it's again very simple source code actually doing to get, and it's just displaying this, hello world things. Okay, so this is the title and this is the body. And the request information, so here when you execute it, it actually display request information. So this is displaying the HTTP method, and this is the request URI, and this is the protocol path information and the remote address. So if you take a look at the code, so it's basically calling get method, get request URI, get protocol, get path information, and get remote address. Okay, so these are the methods you can call from this HTTP Servlet request object. Okay, so where am I? Going back. Now, request header. Suppose if I want to see all the request header information, here you execute it. You can see the host, connection, user agent, accept, referrer, accept encoding, cookie information. Okay. Again, if you take a look at the code, it's basically the calling. It gets all the header names, right? And then it using while loop to display the value of each header. Okay. And request parameters. Okay, so this is the request parameters. So here, suppose I'm actually sending XYZ and ABC, something like this, and submit. Okay, so it just display what has been received by the server. Okay, so if you take a look at the code, oops. It is actually using the get parameter. Oh, okay. So it's actually using get parameter names. So then it's iterating those the parameters. Okay. So you can actually change all this code and play around it. All the source code is inside this the default package and hello world example. So the So this is the request param example code, okay, that we have seen. So this is the example that is actually calling get parameter method. Okay, so you can take a look at the Java documentation of this HTTP servlet request. If you take a look at the Java doc, you can see it does have all this method: get parameter names, get parameter values, get parameter map, and all those things. Okay, so this object, HTTP servlet object, captures everything that is coming from the client. Okay. Okay, so oops. And the cookies. So these are the cookie information that is sent. We are going to talk about the concept of cookie when we talk about session tracking later on. So if you don't understand these cookie things, don't worry about it. Okay, so again, this is a set of cookies that are coming from the client. So here I can create another cookie that contains some information like this. Okay, and submit. Okay, and it's returned from the server, and the code is basically is going to call get cookies method of the request. Okay, and it will display all the cookies. Okay, so that is the end of the presentation, and I have to go like in 3 minutes because I'm going to do Spring Framework Spring MVC View Technology webinar in 10 minutes. So let me just make sure that I save